Hello and welcome to the Global Church Project. I'm Graham Hill. Lamin Sanneh was born in the Gambia. He's a descendant from an ancient African royal line. He serves as Professor of Missions and World Christianity and History at Yale Divinity School. He's the author of more than a dozen books and scores of articles. Lamin Sanneh converted from Islam to Christianity and writes extensively on the relationship between these two world religions. He also explores the emerging shape of world Christianity. Lamin Sanneh teaches and conducts research at many prestigious universities, including Yale, Harvard, Cambridge, and the University of London. He's a commander of the National Order of the Lion, Senegal's highest national honour. Lamin Sanneh, welcome to the Global Church Project.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
You're a professor at Yale Divinity School. Can you tell us something about your role at this university and seminary?
I have 3 appointments at Yale. I'm Professor of World Christianity and Mission here at the Div School. I'm also a Professor of History at Yale University, so I teach undergraduates. And I'm also a Professor of International Area Studies in the Macmillan Center. 3 appointments, but 1 paycheck.
Yes.
It harkens back to the days when at Yale professors taught for the privilege and the honor of teaching at Yale.
Yes.
I teach for the paycheck.
Yes. When did you decide that you wanted to get into education in this area?
It was really while I was teaching at Aberdeen University in Scotland, where I was teaching in Islamic studies, which was my appointment, and my colleagues asked me to teach courses in African Christianity. I protested, but they wore me down, so I agreed, because a colleague, Aidan Hastings, was going to be away on sabbatical, and Harold Turner from New Zealand had retired. And so I did some reading, 6 months of research, and in the process I discovered things I never expected to discover, so that I stumbled on the theme of the engine of the missionary movement being the translation movement, the translation of the Bible into the vernacular, and the development of the vernacular with grammars and dictionaries. And in that way, I saw immediately that Christianity in mission was invested in the development of indigenous cultures. That was never my expectation when I started.
Now, you've written quite a lot on post-colonial theology, and also on the shift from the global north to the global south, if you want to use those terms. Can you tell us something about what post-colonial thought and theology is, and also what is the shift that has happened to the majority world today?
Well, post-colonial in my language means the era, the period following the end of colonial rule. And I use it to indicate that there seems to be a stream, a current, or 2 currents, in fact, that are interacting and flowing in different directions. One is the withdrawal of colonial powers from colonial territories, and the other is the surge of conversion to Christianity. And this current of Christian conversion I found really surprising, and I began to think that it must be because within Christianity itself, the mission of the church, seeds were planted that took time to germinate, and when they did, it really didn't matter. In fact, it was helpful that the colonial impediment was no longer there to obstruct the growth of Christianity. That's exactly what happened. I lived in Nigeria at the time, in the 60s, and in Nigeria there were probably 8 million Christians altogether in all the denominations, Catholic, Anglican, Methodist. But today, the Anglicans alone, the Church of England, followers in Nigeria number about 18, 19 million. Methodists are not too far behind. So the real growth of Christianity in Nigeria happened to coincide with the era following the end of colonial rule. And so post-colonial for me is not an ideological description, it's a historical marker of the transition from the colonial and the missionary era to the period when Christianity became actually effective on the ground.
Mm. When you look at the explosive growth of the church in Africa today, what do you think are some of the reasons why that has happened?
Well, to simplify the answer to that question, there is almost an overlap between areas of high Christian impact and areas of the growth of the development of the vernacular.
Mm.
Almost necessarily so. Or put it another way, rather striking. Where people have lost the indigenous name for God in Africa, there the conversion to Christianity has been minimal. Yeah. It's only areas where the indigenous name for God has been preserved and where the scriptures are available in the vernacular, in the mother tongue, that we see the greatest impact of Christianity. The other reason, I think, for the growth and expansion is that the colonial impediment, or you might say the colonial embarrassment, got out of the way. And so indigenous agency, coupled with the vernacular Bible, helped to give the impetus to the growth and expansion of Christianity.
When you look at the Church of Africa today, what do you think are the key things that it can teach the churches of the West?
In my thinking, I think of the mission of the church as being transnational, universal, and across all time and space. I see Christianity creating communities of believers whose faithfulness to the gospel takes precedence over their ethnicity, their race, and their nationality. And so when I think of what is it that the churches in Africa can teach the West, I think essentially of partnership and mutual respect and mutual help in the mission of God, which is a mission entrusted to all believers, to the church, and to the members of the church.
What do you think are some practical ways that Christians in the West can partner with, collaborate with, not only African, but other churches in the majority world today?
Well, there should be reciprocity. Christianity in the West has been in decline, if not numerically, certainly in influence. Christianity as a religion has been sidelined in the West. But the West is still endowed with enormous resources. It has the intellectual capital, it has the social capital, the great universities, great libraries, great theology, great cathedrals, great music, fantastic art. I just came from London, where I went to the National Gallery, and it's really fascinating to track, with the help of a professor from King's College London, the Christian theme that runs through Western art. It's quite remarkable. In Africa and elsewhere, we haven't acquired those assets yet. But we have living monuments as testaments to the Christian faith. Believers across all cultures, all races, all classes. And it seems to me that the momentum, the surge, the energy, the impetus of confidence in the gospel, which the West seems to lack, but which has been very evident in the third world, what you call the majority world, that this impetus could actually help the West to recover theistic faith and to adjust its rather painful compact with secularism, in which Western theology and Western Christianity became co-opted into Western cultural prevailing norms, and ending with the cultural captivity of the gospel. And maybe this partnership can help the West recover this ancient heritage that has meant so much to the rest of the world.
When you see parts of the majority world getting wealthier and many young people in parts of the majority world becoming part of a global society, Do you think that secularism will offer real challenges for the churches of the global south as well in the future?
Secularism, we should understand, is a neutral value. It doesn't come itself loaded with norms and prescriptions about how to live one's life. What are the values worth living for? How do we take care of one another? We should remember that the United States, when it started out as a young republic, setting up an experiment in democracy, reflected on the legacy of the Greeks or the philosophers. And Jefferson wrote very clearly that the philosophers had much to offer us, but there was something more that should make America a success that philosophy and the Western secular tradition could not provide. And that really has to do with faith and confidence in God's mind for life and for our position as partners, co-workers with God, in taking care of one another. And it seems to me, therefore, that secularism comes begging for faith in something bigger and better than just acquiring money, because that only means that those who have money can take care of themselves, but taking care of yourself in a society that is in shambles or in disarray ultimately is self-defeating. And this is why faith is so critical, even to secular values.
One of the big challenges for the church today is how it relates to other religions.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of press, of course, about Islam. How do you think that the churches of the majority world are relating to Islam today? What are some lessons that we might be able to learn from them in those relationships? What do you see happening?
Well, my view is that the challenge of interfaith relations is fundamentally a theological challenge. What kind of God do we believe in? Is it a God of mercy, a God of love? For Christians, it's a God who is involved in a historical breakthrough of reconciliation, a God who saves, who redeems, who reconciles, who forgives. And to pursue the mission of this God requires Christians to be in faithful and positive engagement with Muslims across the interfaith divide. In Africa, relations between Muslims and Christians going back over 100 years have been actually very important for both sides, for both Muslims and Christians. Most Muslim leaders in modern Africa were educated in Christian schools, even when they had the option of government schools. Muslim parents opted to send their children to Christian schools. In many places in Africa, families are interfaith. They're both Muslims and Christians living together within the same family. I think the political challenge for Islam is how to be religious without demanding a role for government or the state in promoting and advancing religious claims. So the role of persuasion, what we would call the role of civil society, the Islamization or the Christianization of society should not be a department of the government or an office of the state, but should really be an outflow of the faithful witness of believers, both Muslim and Christian. And this will avoid then the danger of the Islamization of the state and the production of a radical ideology of hatred, of intolerance, and of mistrust.
There's been a lot written recently about the mission of the church and what it might mean to be missional in Western settings. I'm really interested in what the churches of the majority world, the churches of Africa, can help us understand about what is the mission of the church and how does the church pursue that mission. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, in my view, the mission of the church is to bear witness to Christ. and in bearing witness to Christ, to deal with the challenges we face in alternative forms of identity that are quite destructive because they are divisive, including sometimes religious identities. But the mission of Christ is to overcome these divisions and to bring healing and hope, generosity and honor to the God who Christians know through Christ. And I think that religious core is absolutely fundamental to the identity and the credibility of the church as a divine institution.
What do you think is most misunderstood about the majority world church today?
The most misunderstood aspect of the majority, or called majority church, I don't like the word majority church.
What term would you prefer to use?
I would call the third world.
The third world, yeah.
For theological reasons, rather than statistical or economical reasons, or even industrial reasons. I think the most fundamental misunderstanding of the church in the third world is a kind of secular or liberal misunderstanding of the church. It's very easy for a cleavage to develop in the minds of critics in the West about the church in Africa and Asia being conservative and intolerant. And this assumes that the church has power to define society. I do not think that most churches in Africa and Asia really think of creating a theocracy. They don't have the power, they don't have the inclination, they certainly don't have the theology or the resources to do that. Most churches in the third world want a neutral state that is balanced in its relationship with religious communities, that is not anti-religious, doesn't favor one religion over another. And to that extent, I would have thought that the liberal West would welcome that kind of development. So this secular understanding or misunderstanding of the church in the third world, I think does really disservice to where the church is in society and in history. But I think it diminishes the prospects, the potential of Western partnership and collaboration with the churches to advance human rights, especially the education and the advancement of women in these societies.
I've asked you what's most misunderstood about the majority world church. What do you think is most misunderstood about your writings? Anything?
Again, I haven't really come across much. I've come across a lot of misinterpretation of what I'm saying or not saying. I'll give you one example. My memoir, published recently, was reviewed in one place where the reviewer went into the review with the idea that because I am a convert from Islam, there must be a kind of anti-Islamic feeling in my writing. So he accuses me of Islamophobia. Well, actually, there's nothing in the memoir that says anything negative about Islam. If I've said anything critical, it's actually about Christianity and against Christianity. And secondly, many of my Muslim friends actually welcome my memoir as a statement of the understanding of religion that they deeply covet for Islam themselves. And so that's one example. It's as if people have not read my book, they just make an assumption that I would be coming at it from an angle that they would like to criticize. So they need a foil, they need an object to attack for their own purposes. So that doesn't really worry me too much. But I do think that one area of difficulty for Western readers for my work on mission and translation, the Bible and culture, gospel and culture, is the Western reluctance to abandon culture as a normative criterion of truth of the gospel, which is founded on the idea that the more advanced we are, the more money we have, the wealthier we are, the more lavish a wardrobe we have, the more educated we are, the more we can grasp the mind of God. And therefore the closer we are to what God wants. But the poorer you are, the less you have in the world, the less educated you are, the less you have access to the mind of God. This is the cultural divide.
Yes.
That culture for the West is the key to faithful Christian life. And since the churches in Africa and Asia have less of that than the West, they must be less privileged, they must be less they must be more disadvantaged vis-a-vis access to the mind of God. And my writings are actually a challenge to that understanding of the gospel. Because I say if that was the case, Jesus died at a very early age, so he didn't have longevity. I don't think he lived in a culture of silent plumbing, of electricity, of the internet, of paved roads, of vehicles and transportation systems that are the envy of the world. He never lived in that kind of world, nor do the prophets of the Old Testament. And by the way, for the secular West, they should remind themselves that neither did Plato, nor Aristotle, nor Socrates lived in that kind of society. But we do not abandon, we do not overthrow their teachings on the basis that they were not modernized, they were not educated, they didn't have good sanitation, they didn't have good electricity, and so forth and so on. But I think the cultural captivity of the gospel in the West is a serious problem for Christianity.
Is there anything else that you wanted to say to us today?
I think the encounter with radical Islam, for me, with extremist violence in the Muslim world, is a reminder, a wake-up call to the West, that the theological underpinning of the value system of the world remains underexplored and underappreciated by a secular West. And we ignore this problem, this challenge, at our peril. And I do a lot of work trying to interpret the mind of the Muslim world to the West and vice versa. But I must say that in recent years I've become a little concerned, a little jostled by the lack of urgency, the sense of urgency in the West about the religious nature of the challenge we face. We think in the West that we can meet the challenge of Islam, of radical Islam that is, with economic measures, with military measures, with political alliances, but I'm not convinced that that will actually solve the problem or meet the challenge we face.
And how would you suggest that Christian leaders today become more informed about these challenges and a preferred constructive response?
The best way to understand the Muslim mind, in my view, is to be absolutely certain and clear about the core values of the gospel, the core values of the West. Respect for life, respect for women, equal education for boys and girls, care for the orphan, for the sick, for the outcast, for the stranger. These ideas of civic righteousness, which are grounded in civil society, not in government initiatives, these values are key to who we are as a people. And they also remain our values even if people disagree. We have a lot to contribute to the world, we have a lot to share with the Muslims, but they will respect us only if we respect ourselves. I give you one example. There's been a lot of criticism of the attempt by some Christian institutions to give space to Muslims to make the call to the prayer. Now, Muslims, for their part, say, we have not asked for that concession from the Christians because we cannot reciprocate. We cannot ask you, Christians, to come to the mosque and for you to make your appeal for worship from our mosques. We cannot reciprocate. We cannot give you that privilege. So why give us something we don't want, we never asked you for, in order for you to demonstrate that you're really on our side? We don't doubt that you're on our side, but you don't have to give up who you are in order to be our friends. Why? Well, because we are afraid, Muslims are speaking and thinking, we're afraid that down the line you will ask us Muslims to give up something that is dear to us, that is particular to us, in the interest of interfaith relationship. And that's a kind of false solidarity, and we don't want that.
Lamin Sanneh, thank you for joining us at the Global Church Project.
Thank you for inviting me to speak on it.
The Global Church Project is located at www.theglobalchurchproject.com. On our website you'll find a wide range of interviews and resources for colleges, universities and churches. I look forward to your company next time. From me, goodbye.